This is Chapter 2, Listening and the Ethics of Speech. Today in this PowerPoint slideshow, I will cover speaking with an open ear, communication and understanding, listening beyond noise, and finally, an ethics of speaking as a listener. Moving on to the first slide, speaking with an open ear. Public speaking is viewed as a form of calling to an audience. So think about it like this. You are calling to your audience. You are sending a message to your audience. And what that indicates is that listening is a precondition of speaking. Now just think about that for a moment. Listening is a precondition of speaking. We learn how to speak. You're taking this class right now, how to speak well, how to deliver a message to an audience, how to adapt to an audience. But how often do you learn how to listen? And it's really a precursor to being a good speaker is becoming a good listener. So it's important to understand listening. Listening is the process of actively making meaning of messages. So I'll say that again. Listening is the process of actively making meaning of messages. Noise, which interferes with effective listening or has the potential to interfere with effective listening, is anything that distorts or distracts from a message in the context of communication. We have two main types of noise that you want to take into consideration whenever you're listening to someone or to something. External noise is that physical noise. So external noise could be you're outside listening to a speaker and there's a plane flying overhead. There's physical noise there to distract you. Or you're in a traditional classroom and your professor is talking and then you have the projector that's humming along. That's an example of physical noise, and that can distract you from listening as effectively as if that noise was not present. And then internal noise also impacts how well we listen or the ability with which we do listen. So physiologically, if you're not feeling well, that's going to impact how well you can listen. If you didn't get enough sleep, that's going to impact how well you listen. If you have a temperature, that's going to impact how well you listen. So that's internal noise. And then psychological noise is also a form of internal noise. If you had a fight with a partner the night before and you need to give your speech the next day, or you need to sit in class and listen to a really important lecture, you're going to have some psychological noise there, and it can really impact how effectively you listen. So you always want to take noise into consideration and do your best to eliminate some of those distractions for both internal noise and external noise. Moving on to the next slide, first starting with perceptual filters. We have talked about perceptual filters before, but just to recap briefly, perceptual filters are all of those elements that make you who you are and affect how you receive messages and you perceive things and situations and people and experiences. Perceptual filters are the social class that we are raised in, our race, our gender, our sexual orientation, our religion, social institutions that we belong to, the family that we were raised in, the country that we were raised in. These are all perceptual filters. And these filters affect the assumptions that we make. So we make a lot of assumptions, and then those assumptions can lead to misunderstanding. So what do we do about that? Because you could look at one person and they're raised one way in one country with one family, and then you could look at another person who was raised another way in another family in another country, and they might communicate just fine, but there might be a lot of misunderstanding. It is completely normal. So what do we do though with this? How do we move more toward understanding? We have to understand that there is such a thing as selective perception, and that is the ways in which people attend to the things they like and they ignore the things they don't like. You are human. If you do this, we typically want to move toward the things that we like and we ignore the things that we don't like. Let's say you're in a relationship and you really love 9 out of 10 things that your partner does, and then there's just that one thing that you don't like and you just tend to ignore that, and that's selective perception. Selective exposure is a psychological theory suggesting that people prefer information that supports their views and avoid information that does not. So what do we know about people? That we typically do selectively expose ourselves to certain types of information. So if you are of one political persuasion, you might watch Fox News. And if you're of another political persuasion, you might watch CNN. It just depends. So you're going to expose yourself to information that supports your view. You're not going to watch another news station that makes you upset. I mean, you might, and it would be a great thing if you did, because you could get to see a variety of different aspects or takes on a particular institution, person, aspect of government, whatever that might be. But in general, so that we understand each other better, we know that most people do selectively expose themselves to things, events, people, information that supports their views, and they tend to avoid the ones that do not. Also, there's such a thing as selective listening. The ways in which a person attends to some auditory information, speech or sound, and ignores others. We have to selectively listen, because if we didn't, if we picked up on every single sound that was all around, it would be really, really difficult to focus in on specific people or specific stimuli or a stimulus, whatever it might be. So what you have to do as a listener is, if you know you easily get distracted and you need to listen to a speech or to a lecture, you want to make sure that you're not sitting by the door, so that when people are walking by in the hallway that you're not distracted. So it's really important that you know who you are and how you learn and how you listen. And then finally, the type of listening that you want to go for in this class, and whenever you're listening to something that's important to you, or if you're listening to a lecture, is active listening. And that's the technique of observing and responding to a speaker's verbal and nonverbal messages with the goal of understanding. That you've literally set the goal. Let's say you're going into a lecture, you set the goal for understanding, the goal for analyzing, or if you're listening for pleasure, or if you're listening for empathy, that you've actually set a goal for yourself. And when you listen, you break a sweat. Not literally, but metaphorically, you break a sweat. You're listening with your eyes as well as your ears, and that's active listening. So what are some of the reasons why we do not listen? Well, we know noise. That's one of the reasons why we don't listen well. Another one is selective listening. We may not want to hear what the other person has to say, like Jim Carrey over here. Maybe you don't want to hear the information about something that you don't agree with. So that's selective listening. And then there's defensive listening. So if you've ever heard yourself say, yes, but. So you're listening to someone and they're telling you their side of the story, and then you say, yes, but. So just know, whenever you make a yes, but, that you are listening defensively. You're not really listening well. You're not really listening effectively, because you're waiting just long enough for them to pause and to finish telling their side of the story so that you can defend yourself. So just really be mindful with how you're listening to other people and listening to speeches. Again, let's say you're listening to a speaker that is not of your political persuasion, and you might not really give the speaker the benefit of the doubt, and you might listen really defensively, looking to pounce on anything that they say that you disagree with or that you think might be unfounded, et cetera, et cetera. So really being mindful, that's another reason why we do not listen, is we're defensive. There are cultural differences in how people listen as well. So when we talk about high and low context culture, I will go a little bit more into some of the cultural differences for not listening well. And then sometimes we pretend listen, and that's also known as counterfeit listening. So if someone's telling you something and you're pretending that you're listening, but you're really not, again, it's one of the reasons why we don't listen. I'm not judging you, but I'm just saying that counterfeit listening is something that really, really does irk people in general. Moving on to ethics, what do we know about listening? There is a response ability. So listening involves an ethical orientation toward others. There's an ethics that is involved in listening. You are bound to a set of ethics. It's really the golden rule. Think about it like this: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And there is something that's referred to as the pact of speech. So the pact of speech, think about it like this, as an agreement that you make with your audience. And there's two parts to that agreement. It's that unspoken agreement that you have made with your audience. Number one, that you're accountable, that you that you actually put some effort into this. You're held accountable. The audience expects you to have something to offer them. So you need to be held accountable as a speaker. Again, there's that agreement between two or more parties that the listeners will listen to you respectfully, and then you, the speaker, will give them something that is worthy of them listening to. The example that's used in your textbook is at Caesar's funeral. Antony gives a speech in which he attempts to persuade those in attendance to hunt down those responsible for Caesar's death. And he begins his famed speech with, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." And in effect, he's saying, hey folks, I have something to say, so listen up. And side note here, I'm digressing a little bit, but Cicero was put to death, and Antony, who pretended to be his friend, kind of sold him down the river. So more on that in the actual video, so you might want to listen to that on a lesson from Rome about Cicero. So you want your audience to listen, but you don't necessarily say to them, you have to listen to me. And that's part of the pact. And then the other part of the pact is ethics. Aristotle believed that a speaker has to be ethical, and the speaker must cultivate 3 character traits to model responsible and credible speaking. Number 1, practical wisdom. So practical wisdom is essentially, you have to be prudent in your reasoning, and you have to be careful about the implications that you make and the consequences of sharing your wisdom. So there are consequences to information that you give to people, and you need to have the wisdom to know what's important to share and not to share, what information is helpful and useful and what information is not. And you need to be able to use discernment, and you need to have some common sense. And the next one is expertise. So the audience expects that speakers be reasonable, to know what they're talking about. So not expert in the sense where if you are talking about an organization of Nike that you need to be an expert in Nike, but expert in the sense where you've done your homework, you know what you're talking about. You explain to the audience how you know what you claim to know, and also that you avoid plagiarism. And in this day and age, there's really no reason to plagiarize, because there is so much information at your fingertips to help you with quoting information properly, with citing information, how to paraphrase, how to summarize. I mean, I know you've heard this before. Back in the day, I literally had to go to the library and I had to get my APA and MLA handbook manual out. And I had to look up every single source in the library, and I had to look up how to cite every single source that I used in that book, and I had to handwrite it. So today, though, you can go to our library database, you can look up a peer-reviewed academic journal article, you can check advanced search, full text PDF file, and then you can check APA citation, and it's right there for you. So you have a lot at your fingertips. There's no reason for you to plagiarize. Avoid plagiarism at all cost. When in doubt, ask a librarian, cite your source. Remember not to quote all of your material or big chunks of material. Take that information and put it in your own words. Think about it like this. If you were to quote a paragraph of information, and let's say you're incorporating information about Nike from the organizational culture of Nike, would you really want to quote a paragraph of information from an academic peer-reviewed journal article? I mean, that's really boring. So you would never want to quote a paragraph, but you would want to paraphrase that, or you could summarize it and put it into your own words. Remember, writing for the ear is different than writing for the eye. So you're going to take that information, you're going to cite the source both orally and in the text of your outline and in a reference page, and you're going to put that information in your own words. So really, there's no excuse for plagiarism in today's day and age. And then finally, goodwill. You have to have goodwill for your audience. You want to acknowledge their presence, acknowledge that they're there and that you have good intentions for them, that their well-being is important to you, and that is one of the capstone qualities, if you will, or character traits of a good speaker. What Socrates would say is the good person speaking well. Always acknowledge the people that are there So last spring at Honors Convocation, I was the MC of the convocation, and the very first thing I did was to acknowledge all of the people that made it possible for each of those students to receive an award, to receive recognition, because no one can do it alone. And there was someone who helped you get to where you need to be to receive the accolades or to achieve whatever it might be that you want to achieve. So I acknowledge the presence of all the people who made it possible for those students to be receiving awards that evening. So it's really important to acknowledge the presence of the people in your audience and to thank them, because they're taking time out of their day, out of their life to listen to you talk, and that's noteworthy, especially in a culture that is so time focused and centered. You just want to thank them because they didn't have to be there for you, and they're taking their time. So thank them for that. Acknowledge their presence and acknowledge the time that they took to be there just for you. So what are some of the guidelines for ethical speaking? They're real simple. Know your stuff. Do your homework. Do not waste people's time. It's probably the most limited resource we have in this culture is time. So know your stuff and don't waste people's time. Number 2, be prepared. If you procrastinate and wait until the last minute, that's fine, as long as you can get it done. I'm not here to judge. So if you can get it done, get it done. If you're up all night, that's fine, but make sure that you're prepared when you actually go out in front of your audience and you start to record your speech. Demonstrate respect. Respect for your audience. Don't alienate them. I can tell you stories about speakers that did not demonstrate respect and how that really, really burned me as a speech professor. I can tell you, I won't even tell you, but if you ever see me sometime on campus, I'll tell you some stories. And then finally, do no harm. With your speech, do you have to say it? Okay, so if you're conveying information, do you have to say it? Is it going to be useful? Is it going to be helpful? Why are you using these words? Why are you communicating X, Y, and Z to the audience? So do no harm. Do no harm. And if you look over here, one of the most sincere forms of respect is actually listening to what another has to say. So what do we talk about today? Speaking with an open ear, communication and understanding, listening beyond noise, and finally an ethics of speaking as a listener. And I leave you with this in the words of the great Thich Nhat Hanh. Deep listening is the kind of listening that can relieve the suffering of another person. You call it compassionate listening. You listen with only one purpose, to help him or her to empty his heart. And more simply stated, Thich Nhat Hanh says, when we listen, we relieve suffering. And I believe that to be very true. What do you think?